Levin. I go by Reese, and I am going to be the speaker today. I am currently a researcher at Stanford University in California, and I am an archaeologist. And I just got back from 4 weeks on Pingelap. And so what I'm going to tell you about today is the Pingelap Archaeological Project, which I've been directing for the past few years. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the results from our work in 2017. And then I'll also tell you a little bit about the results from this year. And I also want to finally explain why this is important, why it matters, why we should do archaeology on Pingelap. So I'll go ahead and turn out the lights. That helps a little bit. All right, is that good, the lighting? All right. All right, so the first thing I want to do is talk a little bit about archaeology. So I know that some of you from this college went to Langer Island with the Japanese group last year and got to do some work out there. Is there anybody here who did that? Went out to Langer Island? All right. Well, then, so I'll talk a little bit about archaeology. So basically what I do as an archaeologist is study the human past through the material remains that people leave behind. And the thing that I think is really great about archaeology is that everybody leaves an archaeological record. No matter what you do, you are going to leave behind something from the activities that you perform on Earth. And so it's one important way we can access knowledge of the human past. Of course, there are many other ways. There are oral histories, there are written histories. Not everybody ends up in the oral histories and written histories. Everybody ends up in the archaeology. And so it provides this unique set of material data. And one thing I talk about, I also want to tell you a little bit about my philosophy on archaeology is a lot of people like to use the word discovery, and I tend to not use the word discovery because I don't think that archaeologists actually discover anything. Rather, I think that what we do is recover knowledge. Knowledge that people had before, or knowledge that was out there, and we kind of aggregate it. So I see it as really recovery of knowledge rather than a process of discovery. So I want to move on to talking about the Pacific Ocean. We'll talk a little bit bigger. Of course, we are right now in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and the Pacific Ocean is 1/3 of the Earth's surface. So this is enormous. We can look on the globe at the Pacific Ocean and barely see the continents. And the Pacific is one of the last major regions of Earth to have been settled by humans. And a lot of people in continental areas think that this is vast and remote, but I think it's really useful to think about the Pacific in other ways as well. And one author whose writing has really influenced me on this is Apeli Hau'ofa and his essay, Our Sea of Islands. And so Hau'ofa was a Fijian and Tongan anthropologist, and so his essay challenges colonial narratives about Oceania and the way that academic study has enforced these narratives. And so what he says is our ancestors who had lived in the Pacific for over 2,000 years viewed the world as a sea of islands rather than as islands in the sea. This may be seen in a common categorization of people, as exemplified in Tonga by the inhabitants of the main capital island, who used to refer to their compatriots from the rest of the archipelago not so much as people from the outer islands, as social scientists would say, but as kakai me tahi, or just tahi, people from the sea. This characterization reveals that the underlying assumption that the sea is home to such people. And so I think it's really important to consider the way that people think about the world that they live in. We all have our own cultural context, we all have our own cultural baggage, and when doing research we carry that baggage, so we need to know what we can do to understand that and better get into the minds of people elsewhere. So the Pacific Ocean, we generally, archaeologists and anthropologists often talk in terms of 3 cultural areas. So these are somewhat problematic. There's Polynesia, Melanesia, and Micronesia. These are old colonial terms, and Melanesia and Micronesia don't necessarily mean a whole lot linguistically or culturally. Micronesia, as many of you may know, was settled at least 2 different times, maybe 3 different times, from people migrating from Melanesia. Pohnpei specifically was settled, we think probably from the Southeast Solomon Islands or Vanuatu, from people moving north. But we do use this shorthand. It primarily serves as a geographic shorthand. So when I talk about Micronesia, I'm just saying that to refer to the general geographic region. What I think is a more useful classification when we're actually talking about prehistory is near Oceania and remote Oceania. So near Oceania is this area here that includes New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, and people settled this area very, very early on. New Guinea was settled by at least 50,000 years ago, and people ventured out into these islands in the Pleistocene. And then remote Oceania was settled beginning about 3,000 to 3,500 years ago by Austronesian-speaking populations who moved in. Central Eastern Micronesia specifically, and what I'm talking about here is generally Chuk, Pohnpei, and Kosrae, the earliest archaeological dates from this area are about 2,000 years ago. This may be getting pushed back, but right now this seems to be the consensus date. And the area was likely settled from the Southeast Solomons and Vanuatu. We have multiple different types of islands in this region. So right now, we're on a high island. Everyone knows where that is, of course, right? Where is that? Soquez Rock, right? So high islands are the result of volcanic eruptions on the ocean floor. They eventually pierce the surface of the ocean, and they can form large volcanic islands. Volcanic islands can be quite large. For example, the island of Hawaii is more than 10,000 square kilometers. Atolls are just at a later stage in the geological process. So in many tropical waters, coral reefs grow around the island, and it takes thousands of years to form a fringing reef that's right along the edge of the island. Over time, a volcanic island will subside, and this is geological time, so this is a really, really long time frame. And it develops a barrier reef with many islets encircling a volcano. And so Pohnpei is one such island that has a barrier reef. And eventually the volcanic island subsides completely beneath the surface, and all you're left with is the coral islands. And that is an atoll. And this here is an example of an atoll. Does anybody know what atoll this is? Yeah, it's Mokyo. So atoll environments generally have low biodiversity and fewer known native terrestrial species edible to humans, of course, lots of marine species. They also tend to have a high susceptibility to adverse weather events like typhoons. And in many cases, they're extremely isolated, although certainly not all. There's also a somewhat low accessibility to fresh water. So there is this thing called the Gibbon-Herzberg lens sitting right here. And what happens here is that the rain falls and it gets caught here, but because the fresh water is lighter than the salt water, it creates this freshwater lens that sits on top of the saltwater, and so that is accessible to populations that live on atolls. And so you can dig wells for rainwater, and of course, most people build catchments where you're catching the rain directly. And people have lived in these atolls for 2,000 years or longer. So humans also has shown by paleoecological and archaeological data, human habitation of these islands has actually increased their biodiversity, and it's increased the arability, it's increased how productive they are. So people have actually made the soils on these islands better for growing. But nonetheless, a lot of Western scholars have tended to talk about these as so-called marginal environments. Now, I've looked for a good definition of marginality when people are talking about marginality, and I have not been able to find a really good definition. But the characteristics that people seem to include seem to be things like low arability, low biodiversity, and isolation, which would seem to apply to coral atolls. But one thing is that low arability can be contrasted with ocean access. So things like ocean access aren't necessarily considered, and as we'll see when I get into the data from our project, which is hardly surprising if you talk to someone who lives on Pingelap, is that ocean food is tremendously important. And I'm trying to understand these processes in terms of something called niche construction theory. So people are modifying their environments, and we're calling these environments marginal, but people are making them better. Organisms, humans, and other organisms modify selection pressures in their environment in niche construction. And in niche construction theory, they say that ecological inheritance, the changes that people make in the environment, the farming that people do to improve that environment has to be considered as a factor in evolution. This is called ecological engineering. And in humans, culture is really a part of this modification and this feedback. So you have cultural niche construction, and so the development of culture and the way culture reacts is also related to the changes that people are making in their environments. So this is, when we're studying food production processes, this is really important because humans and plants both engineer their environment. And these engineered environments are crucial to the way that human cultures function. So niche construction theory is increasingly applied to understanding agriculture. And so ultimately, here, what I'm interested in is the relationship between the production of food and physical and social environments in the human past. And so this project, the Pingelap Archaeological Project, focuses in on an area in the remote Pacific as a view into these processes. Plant domestication has been present for a very long time in the Pacific Islands. Plants were domesticated in New Guinea by 6,500 BP. People have been using plants in that environment for a really long time. People have been modifying their environments for a really long time. And the settlement of the remote Pacific, people moving into the Pacific Islands, was really enabled by people transporting these plants that were domesticated indigenously in New Guinea and moving them into islands in the remote Pacific. And so we have these arboricultural systems and these root cropping systems that are really common throughout much of the Pacific. And these systems require really long-term planning. So people aren't thinking just on a year-to-year basis. These really require thinking on a generational level. So finally, we'll get into Pingelap a little bit. So here are some things that I would like to start thinking about, things I'd like you to consider as I tell you a little bit about the archaeology of Pingelap. And so what are the ways that Micronesians and Pingelapese have modified or engineered and continue to engineer their landscapes? And some Pacific islands have been described as marginal environments. Is this a useful or accurate concept when considering the deep past. And then also I want to talk a little bit about anthropogenic climate change. So regardless of what the President of the United States might think, anthropogenic climate change is happening. And it's disproportionately affecting Pacific Island communities. So one of the things I want to think about is how anthropogenic climate, how this long-term understanding of modifying environments may be able to help with some of today's problems associated with changing global climates as the environments change. So a lot of people, when they think of Pingelap, who are not from the area especially, might think of Oliver Sacks's book that was named for the island called Island of the Colorblind. It's best known internationally for the high rate of complete achromatopsia, or total color blindness. About 5 to 10% of the population cannot see any color. In the rest of the world, this is about 1 in 30,000. And this is due to a recessive mutation. And this, so this is kind of why what a lot of people think about when they think about Pingelap. But of course, there is so much more to Pingelap. And I want to tell you about the archaeology. So I want to talk a little bit about how people have engaged in these cultural niche construction processes on Pingelap. And in our project, we are using archaeology. So we're using traditional archaeology where we're looking on the landscape and we're trying to find archaeological sites. We are digging and collecting samples and finding artifacts. We're using archaeobotany, and so this is actually what my specialization is looking at plants in the archaeological record and identifying plants, looking at the relationship between people and plants in the past. There's zooarchaeology. Amy Miles, who is a Ph.D. student at Uppsala University in Sweden, is a key member of the project, and she's a zooarchaeologist. She specializes in the analysis of fish bones. We are engaging ethnoarchaeology. Ethnoarchaeology is basically where you use ethnographic practices, so you interview people and you participate in things that they're doing in order to apply that to the archaeological record. And so obviously things have changed since the deep past, and the way that people do things now is not necessarily the same as the way they did things in the deep past. But there can be things that can be learned from talking to modern people and understanding how they use the environment, especially since one of the goals is to understand both how people in the past and the present use the environment. And then finally, we're conducting some ecological survey as well. So Amy, our zooarchaeologist, has been doing invertebrate and vertebrate surveys out on the reef as well. We know that atolls in this region emerged about 3,000 to 4,000 years ago when sea levels stabilized, and they probably took about 1,000 years to become large enough for permanent residence. And there is evidence across the Marshall Islands and in the Caroline Islands for habitation soon afterwards. On Mokiloa Atoll. So Aaron Petit did work there a few years ago, and he showed that there was a continuous human presence from about 1,700 years ago. This is very, very similar to the dates from Pingelap. So this region has been settled for a really long time. People who've been living on atolls in the Pacific, they certainly haven't been avoiding them. They certainly haven't been seeing them as some marginal environment that is a last resort. And so I'll tell you a little bit about the 2017 field season, because we actually have results from this at this point. The 2019 I'll also tell you about. We have very preliminary results from that. And so this is the first test unit we dug. It was 3 meters deep, and gives you a little bit about the idea about the archaeological process. And this is a midden site, which means that people were throwing things away here for 1,700 years, and you can see kind of how some of the layers change, and there's lots and lots of fish bones, lots and lots of coconut shell, charred coconut shell. And what we do with this, one of the first things we do is we draw a profile. And so this tells us how all the layers are constructed. So this tells us how the soil accumulates. And we sent in 8 dates, and we have, and so our earliest dates from this unit were, or sorry, our latest dates from this unit were about 910 to 740 years ago, so fairly recent. And then we also have our latest dates are 1,700 to 1550 years ago. And if you look at this, you can see that the dates slowly get younger as they go up. There's one little reversal here, but in general, they get younger, so it's a pretty good stratigraphy. So this is soil that has been accumulating over time as people build this up. One of the cool things here is there is this, this is a Tridacna clamshell adze, so it is a cutting tool. This is actually in a lower layer than the lowest date. So this may actually be older than 1,700 years. We also put in a test unit in a low elevation agroforest area that was pretty shallow. Not a lot has been accumulating there. And then we also put in a small unit at the edge of the taro patch that was quite disturbed. So unfortunately, there's not as much to share from those sites. These are the prehistoric artifacts that we recovered from test unit 1. These were all from the lower portion. So this is really some of the really old stuff. We have here a shell adze. There's a pendant, and then there's 2 little beads. Amy thinks that one of those beads may actually be an urchin spine, but the other one is definitely shell. And there were a few historic artifacts as well, things like nails, cans, bottles in the very top. So you can find those in the very top layer, and then those quickly disappear. And those are probably from the mid-20th century. So people were using it as an area where basically they were throwing away their waste for 1,700 years. And we are analyzing the environmental data from this, and there's fish that are present like parrotfish, sparrows, groupers, and in the lower layers, requiem sharks. So there's shark material that's coming out just from the lower layers. Unfortunately, we haven't found any of the oilfish yet, but hopefully if any of you are familiar with the Pingelapese oilfish, it's, their bones are very soft, so they don't preserve very well, but maybe we'll find some. In terms of mollusks, there's cone shells, cowries, turban snails, tridacna. There are bird bones, so people were likely consuming bird. There's also sea turtle. In terms of the plant materials, there's things like pandanus. There is palm, there's coconut, which you'd expect to find. And there's also a little bit of breadfruit as well. There's also a large quantity of land snails throughout the deposit. So land snails can be really useful because land snails are really sensitive to environmental changes. When people change things in the environment, when they disturb things, the species composition of land snails often changes. It's been demonstrated on a lot of islands in the Pacific that land snail extinctions seem to happen when people show up on islands, and so the land snail composition will be really interesting to look at. And unfortunately, that's not something that we have gotten to yet, but it is one thing that is planned. But we were not just looking at archaeology, also looking at modern food and farming practices. And people on Pingelap They do, like one Pohnpei, there of course are a lot of imported foods that people eat, but they also do make and catch much of their own food. So this is the lunch that I was generously given one day at lunch. So boiled bananas and reef fish and rice. And so I conducted a survey, I conducted interviews to better understand modern farming practices and how people engage with their landscape. And so this is to both better help the archaeological interpretation and to better understand how my research can better interface with the Pingelapese community's needs. So this is from the 2017 research. I talked with a few more people this time, so these numbers are going to be augmented. This data is going to change a little bit. And the people I talked with who farm, and basically most people on the island do some sort of farming. They grow some sort of plant. And when I asked people what types of foods do you grow, the types of foods that people named, almost everybody named banana, breadfruit, coconut, giant swamp taro as well. So the taro patch is really quite important. As I'm sure you are fully aware, there were also a few plants that were less planted, like for example, yam was grown by about half of the interviewees, which I'd imagine, say on Pohnpei, that number would be very different. And so there were also several plants mentioned by only one interviewee each. There's a few historic introductions, for example, plants like cabbage people grow, and that seems to be something that some people do. When I asked how people maintained their gardens, dead leaves were the most commonly mentioned fertilizer. And these are things like breadfruit, banana, taro, moss, and grasses. And so this is really interesting from an archaeological perspective because I can look at the soils, and one of the things I'm doing is extracting little bits of plants, little bits of plant material, and oftentimes those can come from dead leaves. So I'm able to kind of compare the things that people are telling me here with the things I'm finding in soils from the past as well. And most plants do not need constant maintenance. There was a lot of wide variation in maintenance. Some people constantly check. A lot of people, or some people, talk about really meticulously managing their taro. Some people don't check on it that much. So I want to talk a little bit about the field season we just finished, that we just got back from. We conducted 3 excavations there, and I just want to give you a quick overview. So one of these was an earth oven site. This is test unit 5, and so an earth oven site, people are cooking things, and this goes down 2.5 meters. So people kept saying, oh yeah, it's not going to be very deep. People were cooking here for a little while, but you're going to get to about 4 feet or so and it's going to stop. It didn't. Everybody was surprised. It was really cool. We thought it was going to be really quick too. And you can see the remnants of the earth oven in the side wall of this excavation unit. So you see this charred layer, for example, here and here. And there's a lot of this going down. There's this layer of charcoal, and then there's this layer of sand. And then there's this layer of charcoal, and a layer of sand, and a layer of charcoal. And this goes down like this for 2.5 meters. And at the top, there's a lot of things, like there's a lot of charred coconut husk. There are some chicken bones, but as we get further down, the things we encounter seem to change. So for example, at 150 centimeters, so this is 1.5 meters down, we found a turtle bone. And as we continued to dig further to about 2.5 meters, there was more turtle bone. We also looked at a midden site. So this is life before, where you have that kind of that waste site where things are really piling up. We recovered a whole lot of material from this, so there wasn't as much charcoal, there wasn't as much of those, those thick charcoal layers like you see in the earth oven, that sign of people cooking, but there were lots and lots of fish bones. It's just massive quantities of fish bone. But the material changed a little bit as we went further down. And there were some other things, and you can come up here to see this afterwards. You are more than welcome to take a look. We have pottery. So, pottery cannot be made with the soils on Pingelap. So pottery means that people from other islands, people from islands like Pottery or Pohnpei, were bringing that, either bringing that pottery or bringing the materials to make the pottery. Or it could have been Pingelapis that traveled to those locations and brought it back, of course, too. But what that tells us is that we know that there were these inter-island connections a long time ago, and ceramics also haven't been used for a really long time in the Micronesian region. In Central Eastern Micronesia, they disappeared about 800 years ago, and so these are pretty old. We can guess at this point they're probably about 800 years old, and we're going to send in some dates and find out how old they are. We get down to about 1.5 meters, and we get something that looks like worked basalt, and you are also more than welcome to come up and take a look at this as well. So basalt, another thing, you're not going to find this on an atoll naturally. This would have come from a volcanic island. It is a volcanic rock. And if you take a look at it, it's clear that people were trying to carve it into something. It looks like they were trying to carve it into an adze. And there are shell adzes up here as well, where you can see how similar they look. People were successful in the shell adzes. Not quite so successful with the worked basalt. Basalt is very hard to work, but so there was some really interesting stuff coming from this midden site that's essentially just a trash heap. And outside of the archaeology, we continued with interviews about farming and fishing, and we also participated. One member of the community actually took me out to his taro patch and showed me how he managed it. And then Amy conducted ecological survey. But once the field season is over, project's not over. What's next? We got to analyze everything. So archaeology, I would say, is probably about 1/10 field work, 9/10 lab work. Most of the time, we are sitting in a laboratory looking at things under a microscope or a hand lens and sorting them out and analyzing them and trying to figure out why they're important. So we're going to analyze the plant remains, the animal remains, the artifacts, as well as the interview data, the ecological data. And so that is kind of all of what is coming up and what we're going to be doing over the next year. And I want to come back to the big picture. So we've clearly got people living on Pingelap continuously since about 1,700 years ago, if not earlier. And so I want to come back to the question of, is it appropriate to conceptualize the environment of Pingelap as, say, as more marginal than that of Pohnpei or more marginal than that of any other region? We have this early settlement of the area. People were not avoiding it. Extensive marine resources, lots of ecological engineering, which allowed agricultural plants to flourish. People raised the elevation of the island by continuously building things up and formed soils. And I think it's important to remember that, especially the way social scientists often talk about the Pacific, using the word marginal, it's important to remember that the impacts of colonialism, modern Western conceptualizations of the Pacific, and the demands of the market economy were not present in this region until the 1800s. So all of the things that people might think make the environment marginal or not necessarily stresses until the past 150, 200 years. And I want to come back to Peli Hauofa here. And so he says here, the world of Oceania is neither tiny nor deficient in resources. It was only so as a condition of the colonial confinement that lasted a century and a history of millennia. Human nature demands space for free movement, and the larger the space, the better it is for people. Islanders have broken out of their confinement, are moving around and away from their homelands, not so much because their countries were poor, but because they were unnaturally confined and severed from many of the traditional sources of wealth, and because it is in their blood to be mobile. And so I think, like, as an archaeologist, if we want to better understand how people have settled and thrived in the Pacific Islands for millennia, we really need to rethink the boundaries that have been placed by the Euro-American mindset and come back to better understanding the Pacific as people who have lived in the Pacific for a really long time have. And so Pingelap is this anthropogenically constructed landscape, and there's this continuous and extensive fishing and marine hunting, and we do see evidence for some change over time. So earlier in the record, we certainly do see things like shark and turtle, and those sort of disappear, and we get a lot more reef fish, although reef fish are still very important earlier on as well. And so why is this important? Why do I care? Why should you care? I think that the persistence of food production systems and the way that people manage landscapes is really important in conversations about sustainability, economic independence, and climate change. Today's dramatic climate change is a problem to which Oceania has contributed negligibly, but is disproportionately impacted. And I think it's really important that in conversations about climate change solutions, it should involve islanders who hold traditional ecological knowledge, because Pacific Island communities know their environments really well, have been managing them for a really long time, and they know them better than an outsider coming in saying, hey, you should manage things this way. So thank you very much for your attention. This project could not have been done without a whole lot of funding sources and a whole lot of people. I would like to especially acknowledge in the audience today, His Majesty Doa Kesa, the Nanwarki of Pingelap, and also the Mayor of Pingelap, Smithy Clark, and many, many members of the Pingelapese community helped us out. So, thank you.